My name is Tom Henriksson, and I'm a general partner at venture capital firm OpenOcean. OpenOcean invests in European software startups at a quite early stage, typically at the A round. And we obviously want to invest in startups that then start growing and grow very fast and become something else than startups, i.e. scale-ups and big, hopefully profitable businesses. And during this journey, one of the main things as board members and as investors in the companies that we very much concentrate on is to ensure that the company has great leadership that can tackle all the problems and challenges and opportunities that take place during such a journey. And those journeys, especially when it grows really fast, are typically quite wild ones. So it takes a huge amount of dedication, energy, skill, and even some luck from the leaders to be able to deal with those journeys. So it's an area we are very, very interested in, and that's why we wanted to do this event where we discuss in a virtual fireside chat kind of mode together with two very, very accomplished executives who have been part of various ultra growth, ultra scaling journeys. And they are Lynda Clarizio and Karim Temsamani. And I will now ask the two of you to please introduce yourselves. Lynda, why don't we start with you?
Hi, Tom. And first, thanks for having me join the session. I'm calling in from New York, from Manhattan. This is a global video conference, as you know. Anyway, I've had a multifaceted career, really in many different sectors. I actually started out in law, but I've worked in technology, in data, and in marketing, and I've held a variety of leadership roles as a law firm partner, as a head of corporate strategy, as a deputy CFO, as a division president, and as a CEO. So I really spanned the leadership range. I was at AOL for over a decade, probably in the good days at AOL. My, I guess, most significant role there was as president of their global advertising business, which was a $1.5 billion business when I ran it. More recently, I was the president of Nielsen's media division. That was about a $2 billion business with several thousand employees. And now I'm working as a strategic advisor to startups who are trying to grow and scale their business, including a BidMob and Adjust.com. And I also serve as a board director for several companies, including CDW, which is one of the world's biggest global IT solutions providers. So that's my background in 2 minutes.
It's an amazing background, Lynda. And by the way, we are so privileged to have you and of course Karim as well here today. One question about your background relating to growth. I mean, you've had very large organizations, and you've also seen organizations grow quite a lot. So can you give a little bit of a flavor of that?
In terms of what I've done?
In terms of employees, perhaps revenues and so on, but really organizational growth while you've been there.
I mean, so I've very often have been involved in working with companies that have really scaled their businesses. So when I joined advertising.com, where I took over from a founder, this is when I was at AOL, it had about 200 employees, and we grew to about 1,000 employees, and also tripled or I guess quadrupled the revenue in about 3 to 4 years. So that was, I guess, the biggest experience I've had with growing and scaling a business. At Nielsen, it was a slightly different but similar challenge in that we were really trying to grow and scale our digital business on top of our television business. And there I was very much involved in sort of appending a much larger digital business and restructuring the company to align to tackle that area of growth. So hopefully that's the answer you're looking for.
Absolutely, gives a good perspective. Over then to Karim. What about you? How's your leadership background?
Great to be with you, Tom and Lynda, and everyone else on the call. Thank you for having me. My background is sort of not entirely common. I'm from a Moroccan origins, but I grew up in France. As I did my studies in France, I wanted to escape as quickly as possible, as I thought that the opportunity would not be quite there for me. So I moved to Hong Kong in the early 90s to essentially start my working career there, which was initially in publishing. And I worked in publishing in Hong Kong, in South Korea, and then in Australia for a number of years in magazine publishing and in newspaper publishing. And I made the wise decision in 2007 to join Google, where I spent 12 years, initially running the Australian office, then starting the mobile business for Google, which was essentially a non-existent business in the early days of mobile to, within 2.5 years, $10 billion business. So we saw incredible scale, and obviously that business continued to grow afterwards. And then I moved back to Asia, first in Japan, then in Singapore, but in the same role in running Asia-Pacific for Google. I just left Google about 15 months ago, and now I've joined Stripe, essentially to go back to restart a business, and I'm running a number of financial products for Stripe, and in a slightly different role as well, where I'm now building products rather than running the revenue side of the business, which is really interesting.
All right, fabulous. So both our executives here on this virtual sofa today have had some great experiences in growth and leading large organizations. Let's jump right. We're going to talk about leadership models and philosophies. We're going to talk about scaling, tips and tricks around that, and so on. But let's jump into some real meaty stuff right away. And that would be, would you two, in whichever order you like, share one or even several really tough spots you've been in as a leader? Maybe the toughest spot as a leader, if you can share. Who goes first?
Which of us would you like to start?
Go for it. You're there.
Okay, well, I really have two that I'd like to talk about. First, I mentioned earlier that I was president for several years of advertising.com, which was a company that AOL acquired and was really one of the first companies in the programmatic ad tech space. They were probably the first company there that did that. And when I took over as president, I had to replace a founder, a beloved founder who was also a math genius. And that was very, very tough. It was a very tough position to go in, from the company that had acquired advertising.com as a leader. And so I really thought long and hard about how to approach it. And I'm going to talk later about some of the leadership traits that I value. And I'll talk about honesty and authenticity. And I approached this experience, using those traits. So first, I was very clear to the team when I joined that I was never going to replace the founder, that, the founder sort of held a special role that I could never fulfill, and I wasn't going to try to replace him. And I also was honest with the team about who I was and what my skills were. My skills were not the same as his, but I really spent a long time, making sure they understood that mine were valuable too, and they came to see that. But it was a tough situation to earn their trust. So that was tough, but sort of from a positive way. I think the other experience that is really the toughest, I know Karim wants to talk about this as well, is when you're in a position as a leader having to restructure an organization and make really gut-wrenching decisions about letting people go. It's honestly the hardest thing I've ever done. And I know Karim's going to talk about it too. It's no one likes to talk about it, but you have to do it at some point in your career, and you need to really pull deep in terms of everything you've done as a leader. And I'm interested in what Karim has done, but my approach in dealing with that situation has been, very much, again, being honest, being empathetic about what you're doing as a leader, and being very honest with the people who you're asking to leave. They deserve that. They deserve your respect. They deserve your candor. and then being empathetic with the people who are staying, because, you know, oftentimes they are, you know, very much insecure about what's happened and need to be reassured. So it really is a true test of leadership.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I've had that same non-pleasure myself, and indeed it's super hard. I remember the first time I had to do it, literally was fighting not to cry. I think I managed maybe not to, but it was really on the verge, and it's just hard because it could easily be oneself on that other chair, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Karim, do you want to talk about something similar, or do you have some other interesting stories to share?
No, I think, I mean, if you're asking for the toughest spot you're in as a leader, I think Lynda mentioned it. This is the toughest aspect of leadership. You know, as a leader, you have to make a number of decisions. When you have to make decisions to let people go that are based on performance, they are difficult decisions to make, and it's a difficult process. And many managers really struggle having those decisions those discussions with their teams. But at least you have a very strong rationale for it, and you know, performance discussions should be had to improve an organization. I think the place where you can be in a very difficult spot is when you have to do a restructuring of teams, and it may not be that there's a performance problem for the team, but it may just be that there's a performance problem for the business as a whole, and therefore, as a leader, you need to make a decision to improve the performance of a business. And you know, it happens a lot in all type industries, and I've had to deal with it a lot when we were in publishing. A number of times we've had to restructure organizations to ensure that we could drive towards profitability. But as you know, we have seen recently, it's happened in startups with COVID impacting a lot of companies, and many people have had to do it. And I can tell you, you know, in 2008, when I was at Google, I had to do it at Google. I actually closed a Melbourne office. We had a small Melbourne office. Our main presence was in Sydney, in Australia. But I had to close the Melbourne office because the times were uncertain, and we wanted to be very cautious with regards to how we were scaling the business, and had to take some steps to bring the whole of the business back to Sydney, and let some people go as part of the restructure. And when you have to do that, when it's no fault of the people, it's just a decision to restructure the business, it becomes a very, very tough decisions. You have to make them. But I think from my perspective, they're definitely the toughest decisions that you have to make. And I'm sure a lot of startups and maybe possibly some people that are on the call here are having to do this because of the current economic circumstances that we are all facing.
It also happens in a startup as part of sometimes the natural sort of progression of the business. As you all know, often the people that you bring to put together a business are not the people that can really scale the business or are interested in scaling the business. And so I've been involved in situations and advised startups where the CEOs have had to really make some very, very tough decisions about looking at the initial team and saying, do you really, if you don't want to be part of this journey, then and maybe you're not the right person to be part of this journey. And so for the good of the company and for the good of the business, we're going to have to restructure. Honestly, it's the toughest thing.
Yeah. And I would maybe complement that with, when you're in a business that scales organizationally really, really fast, right? It's just actually mathematics, statistics, that some people will not be a fit. You cannot recruit perfectly all the time. So you will end up after some time having to cull the organization a little bit, I would dare say. So we might come back to this when we get more into scaling and so on, but that was a little warm up only so far. Now for the audience.
If I can, Tom, though,
oh, please.
I wanted to pick up on your point there, because I think what you just mentioned is slightly different in the sense that I would say that it's a failure of leadership. Scaling fast is obviously what a lot of startups should be doing. As a leader, it doesn't give you a blank recruiting check to hope that some of the people you recruit are going to be good enough for you. I think you still need to have a very strong recruiting process to ensure that you recruit people that have the capabilities for the roles that you want to fulfill, that have capabilities that are higher than the current position that you're filling, given the scale that you're expecting, that fit with what you're wanting to achieve as a company, culturally, with your ambitions. I think that if people are not meeting these expectations, it's your responsibility as a leader to try and figure out why first. Like, is there a failure in recruitment first as part of that? Do you have opportunities to give that person a different role to make them succeed? But if your starting point is, I'm going to hire a lot of people, and the first person that's going to pass to some degree the interview bar is going to be recruited, then you're going to have problems in future, because it is incredibly costly, particularly when you're a startup and you have fewer people to do the interviews. It's incredibly costly to have them spend all their time in interviews and then move people out because they're not the right people and having to restart the process again. Like that's a poor financial model for a startup.
Absolutely.
And any company.
No, could not agree more. I guess a lot of the early stage founders, when they start growing fast, they're quite surprised by how much time they initially have to spend time on this, even if they're successful. And many have a hard time, because unless you've been practicing it, it's hard to be a master.
Yeah, correct. And you see that a lot of the successful startups that have been around for a while, the founders have often found people around them that help tremendously in scaling the business. And for many startups, many people stayed for very, very long time as they scaled the business. And therefore, that sort of nucleus of a leadership team was formed very early on, and has been very important for many of the great startups that are now large companies.
Definitely. So maybe one point for the audience. First of all, we have a Q&A button on our Zoom call, so you may post your questions under that one, and we will be checking in frequently and try to address your questions as well as possible. And we're going to come back to scaling and various challenges within that. But let's first talk maybe even slightly more philosophically about leadership models. And for the both of you, let's start with Lynda. I mean, do you have a leadership philosophy? Is there some leadership model that you're following, or how do you think about that?
I very much do have a leadership philosophy, and it's really evolved over the years. So many years ago, I was actually profiled in the New York Times, and I was characterized in the New York Times as having the leadership style of a mother hen. At the time, I was sort of outraged by that. I thought it was a sexist comment, but I've actually come to embrace the term, because the characteristics of a mother hen actually align very much with the leadership traits that I most value. And what are they? So there's really 4, and I've talked about these in other contexts as well, and happy to talk about it here, but they're empathy, honesty, inclusiveness, and authenticity. And let me go through them. So empathy is really the quality of being able to relate and to your coworkers, to understand them, making the effort to do that, to get to know them as people. And I guess for a mother hen, that might be called being nurturing. Honesty, I mean, honesty is really simple, but what it means in the context of a team, it's providing candid, clear feedback, being honest, being direct, encouraging open dialogue and communication. Inclusiveness is really all about making sure everybody feels like they're welcome and that they're included on the team. If you're a mother hen, that would mean that you have a brood and you have to treat all of your brood equally. And then authenticity. Authenticity is about being true to yourself and who you are. And I guess my philosophy is if you are authentic, if you're honest, if you're empathetic, and if you're inclusive, then you have the best shot at people believing in you, trusting in you, and placing their faith in you as a leader. So those are my 4 traits. And if that means being called a mother hen, I'm happy to take it.
I don't think it means that we're going to call it the mother hen leadership model, though. Do you have a name for it? Have you, I mean, is this something that you have gathered over the years from experience, or where does it kind of come from?
I mean, a lot of it does come from being a mother, by the way. I am a mother of two children. I'm from a big Italian family. And a lot of it is what I learned, as a mother, as a parent, as a leader over many years, what it needs to take to drive consensus, but also to drive results. So it comes from experience, and part of it does come from being a parent. And I think, what you learn as a parent is very, very instructive to being a good leader.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Thank you very much. Before we go to Karim, by the way, I just want to address, because we have our first question here, which asks about how you think the current environment, COVID and economic crisis and social crisis, would affect and change leadership going forward. We will come to that in the second part after we discuss the leadership philosophy and model a bit more. We will come to scaling leadership and crisis leadership and so on. So stay patient for a little while more, and we will get there. Now, back to Karim. What about your leadership philosophy?
So I think I'm going to touch on a lot of very similar traits to what Lynda has described. I think she put it really well there. The way I would frame it is that first, in many different situations and with many different people, you have to pull on different aspects of leadership, and you need to adapt as a leader to the makeup of your team and to the circumstances that are around. And I think you might go back to sort of the questions that we've just been asked in the Q&A. This current situation is driving different types of leadership and different needs from leaders than you would normally have in your team. But my philosophy on leadership is that, one, I want to hire the best people possible that have incredible capabilities, that are great to work with, and that are going to work really well together. So the collaborative aspect of leadership is really, really important to me. It's really important because what I want to try and create in team is an atmosphere where we can debate everything with one another. And I really encourage everyone, and that's one of the things that I tell our teams when I join a new team, is that they should feel free to disagree with me. They should feel free to disagree with me in public when we're having all hands and other things. And as long as it's done in the right way, spurring debate, I think, is very important for businesses to move forward. And so how do you ensure that you have the right debate? Well, you need to make sure that, as Lynda said, that you're inclusive, that you have different perspectives to bring to this debate. And you need to ensure that there's a climate of trust, that people don't feel that there's going to be repercussion if they voice disagreement with one another. So inclusiveness and trust are very, very important for it. And then finally, I think one of the things that we must do as leaders is empower our teams and make sure that they have the ability to execute, that we're not on top of them all of the time, that we have very, very clear direction with regards to where we want to take the business, and then remove obstacles for them. And our role is not to do the job for our teams. Our role is in making sure that they have the freedom to do their job, and that we're supporting them in the best way possible. So empowerment is very important there.
Yeah. And the collaboration aspect of people you want to include in your team, how do you actually test for that and really ensure you get people who can collaborate? Because it's easy to say it, then in practice, when people might have slightly conflicting objectives or so on, which obviously we hope they wouldn't be conflicting, but in practice, when you're in different functions, you might be in slight conflict with each other as well. How do you ensure you get people who can collaborate in a difficult, fast-moving environment?
Well, I think, again, our place, and I learned that from Google, like this is not something that I realized as much as I do now before I joined Google, but the recruitment process is such an important part of our job as leaders. And you can learn so much about people as part of the recruitment process, not only through the questions that you're asking, but through the questions that they're asking, and by ensuring that you have the right panel of people interviewing them as well and gathering all of that feedback and essentially having a session after everybody's been interviewed to discuss it. And while some people are very strong in interviews and some are less so, you get so many clues with regards to how people are collaborating by asking a number of simple questions with regards to their past experiences and how they work with others and what the team say about them. And then obviously you can do reference checks around a lot of that, but it's actually very, very feasible to get a tremendous perspective. Then I think there's another element which is really important, which I think you're going to touch on later with regards to some of the things that I know Ben Horowitz has written. But when people come into a culture where collaboration is really key to achieving things, it drives the right incentives for people to be part of that culture and to ensure that the way in which they work is relevant to that culture and that they're fitting it well. And obviously, if that doesn't work, there's always feedback mechanism that you can provide as a manager. But if your starting point is right, meaning the interview process, and you're really drilling on some of these questions, you can get to the right outcomes fairly easily.
When I'm interviewing people, I look for people that have led teams in a variety of contexts, in an athletic context. I've actually had great success hiring a lot of former people from the military, people that have led teams and people that have humility. You can tell when you're interviewing people, you can tell those traits, what they talk about, what's important to them. It's something that I really focus on. I put a priority over that. And I agree with Karim, group interviews or having multiple interviews. I know Google has done that for years and other companies do that. I think it's super, super important. It's really hard to build trust on a team. I mean, it's really, really a hard thing. Part of it's on the team and part of it's on the leader. I've failed in a lot of ways when I've been part of a leadership team, as opposed to being the leader. At the beginning of my career, I often just marched into a room and spoke the truth all the time, because that's what I'm a trained lawyer, a trained Harvard lawyer. That's what I was trained to do. I was also a woman and often the only woman in the room. So I just felt I'm an outsider. I'm just going to come in and tell the truth. And you know what? It didn't always work. People saw me as sort of the outlier that was telling the truth, but really not part of the team. So I actually had to work really hard to, come together, in teams. And I've learned that over the years, but it's something where I see a lot of young leaders often make a mistake. They just want to be right all the time, as opposed to driving for results and driving for collaboration.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And there's a long list of mistakes behind myself as well. What about you, Karim? Any major mistakes you would like to have the chance to correct in advance of doing them?
Well, I think you have to know that failure is part of our jobs, and you have to encourage failures with your team. I mean, one thing that I used to say when I was at Google, when I had spent a number of years there, is that what I appreciated the most is that I could feel free to fail, because the people around and people in leadership knew me well and therefore knew my capabilities as well. And if they saw me failing in one way, they knew that it was not a characteristic or consistent failing that I know I would bounce back and do the next project well. And that goes back to the trust question that Lynda mentioned earlier. Like it's hard to build trust, but when you have it, it just frees you enormously in an organization. So I've had a number of failings. I've had failings on projects directly when products that we've launched haven't worked well enough. I've had failings in recruiting. Like I talk a lot about recruiting with regards to the importance of it, but I've made mistakes in recruiting, and those are very costly because they're not only costly to you as you have to manage sort of the repercussions of it, but they're incredibly costly in a team. When you have a bad manager that is not managing the team well, it could have an influence on hundreds of people, and that's really problematic in an organization. So those hurt very much, and even more than sort of the business failings, in the sense that you're impacting people more than just the bottom line there. I've had plenty of failings in the past with magazines that launched and closed because the business plan was not strong enough. So, I have a long list of failings, and often, these are part of the discussions that you have in interviews as well. Just understanding that, people have gone through a process where they understand that it's not a journey where you'll only hit the jackpot every time you launch something, a journey where you learn a lot from your failures. And that's one of my favorite questions, is asking people about their failures and what they learn from it. And you'll find that some people in interviews have problems either talking about a failure, or the failure they talk about is, more something like sounds like a win, and then the learnings are not there. And that's really a real problem when you don't, failing is absolutely fine. If you don't learn something from it, that's where you're really missing out on an opportunity there.
Yeah. Thank you both. I think it's really important, though, that everybody on the call and beyond hears that it is, we kind of know that it's okay to fail, because it's impossible not to fail sometimes, but it feels bad, and people feel, I guess, insecure when it happens. So it's really good to hear from the two of you that you've done it a lot as well, and it's okay as long as you learn and get up and are better after that. There's a question slightly related to this that I'd like to take here. Well, it's actually a dual question, and I'd like to ask it to both of you, maybe starting with Lynda. So what do you look for in a new candidate, which obviously depends a bit on what position you're hiring for, but outside of the maybe functional position, what are the most important things for you before hiring someone, is the first question. There's a second question as well, but let's start with this one.
Well, I talked about it a little bit earlier. First, I look at some experience at managing teams. I look for humility. I also look for intellectual curiosity. People that are asking why all the time. People that are not necessarily satisfied with conventional wisdom, because those are the traits that I really value on a team: the collaboration, the curiosity, the willingness to challenge convention. Those are things that have made great teams working for me and have made me better as a leader. So those are a lot of the questions that I really, I really press on when I interview people.
Yeah. And the second question then relates to, how do you manage with a so-called B player here? And what kind of a ratio are you looking for in a team between stars and busy bees, is the phrasing of the question, because I guess in a team, not everybody can be a star all the time either.
Do you want me to take that, or Karim?
Yeah, please continue. Why not?
So I don't really see it as B players versus A players. I see it as roles and responsibilities. There's different roles for different team members, and there are different people that are excellent at different roles. And sometimes, and what you really have to make sure is that you have the right people in the right roles. So that's the way and you're right, you need lots of different components of a team to be successful. You can't have people that are all good at one thing or all the same type of personality. You have to look for that mix and that diversity. So I don't know if that's answering your question, but that's the way I approach it.
And since it wasn't my question, I don't know either. But I think it was a good attempt. It was a good attempt. Yeah, Karim, please.
So going back to your initial question, I think the thing that I try to recruit the most for is agility. Mm-hmm. I think it's very relevant for startups because your course is going to change quite dramatically over time. You might even have a totally different business model than you may have at the beginning of the startup life. Like I've seen many startups that have just changed completely their focus over time. And even if you
Karim,
don't...
if I may say, I mean, we have 30 or so businesses we invested in, probably 10 to 15 of those have a different business model today than the one we invested in originally, and they are still good businesses. So indeed.
Some of them are great businesses, and even if you don't change your course, having people that have the ability to learn new things, because the technology changes, and therefore what you need to learn, what you need to do is going to change over time. So just focusing on agility, I think is really important as part of leadership. And then on your question on B players, I really struggle with that in the sense that, particularly as entrepreneurs, what I've found is that the successful entrepreneurs are struggling to find the right word there, but they don't compromise, in the sense that you should want to hire the best person for every single job, and you should not compromise on the quality of people. You should not think or go and think, I'm going to hire an A player here and a B player here. I said, no, I should hire the best person possible for this job that's going to help me scale the company, that's going to challenge me and think about different ways in which I can raise revenue or find a better way to do whatever task that we need to do. And you may end up seeing that some people are stronger than others, and some people are stronger performers than others, which is totally normal in an organization. But I would say, don't start with thinking that you're going to recruit some people that are A's and some people that are B's. That should not be your starting point. Your starting point is, I'm not going to compromise on hiring, and I'm not going to hire the first person that I see. I'm going to have a thorough process, and I'm going to make sure that I don't hire until I have the right person in the job.
Yeah. I wonder how UiPath did it, because they went from 10 people to, I think, 3,000 people in 3-4 years. That's quite an operation if you want to achieve what you just said, which I do agree with, by the way. So
it's a good question for them. I don't know.
Sometimes it's just crazy. We referred, or you referred, both of you, to the Google model a little bit here a couple of times. So Karim, since you spent such a long time at Google, and there's been quite a lot written about Google's leadership model and strong favorability of the team members at Google to the company. Back in the days, I guess it was more or less the best there was for any organization of real size and so on. Have we addressed already here most of what the Google leadership model stands for, or how would you describe it, and what more should we know?
We've addressed some of the traits, and I would say a few things about the Google leadership model. First, Google is a wonderful company with incredible people, and it was a great experience. You have to, I think, when Google started, it was a very, very different company. And the model that it employed then was, quite new for its time, with regards to how it hired, how it, managed the business, how it made decisions overall. Obviously, that was helped by the fact that, the search business is such an incredible business that it afforded Google with a lot of flexibility with regards to how it managed the company. However, having said that, to some degree, because it was so different, I remember that, as many other Google executives did, we often presented to other companies around the Google culture and the Google business model. And, with a little bit of hindsight, you basically also see that some of the things that Google used to talk about was absolutely not applicable to other companies, in the sense that, one of the key things that Google talked about all the time is, this essentially this ability to launch and iterate all the time. You launch a product when it's not ready at all, you get feedback from users and you iterate all the time. A lot of the companies that Google used to talk to, whether they were hardware companies or FMCG companies or other companies, had products that needed to get to consumers, and you can't iterate on those products when they're in the consumer's hands. And therefore, some aspects of what Google, or what made Google successful, just didn't apply broadly to many other companies. However, when you go back to the leadership principles inside Google and how it worked, I think what made it successful is that it drove a tremendous amount of ambition. No matter where you were in the business, you felt like you could go for the moon and have very ambitious goals, and know that you'd have incredible people that would raise their hand to work on that goal. No matter what it was, people would go for really large ambition at Google. You would know that you'd have a great collaborative environment where lots of people across various teams would come and help you accomplish what you wanted to do. And I found one of the things that surprised me the most when I joined, given that I came from a publishing world which was very politically driven internally, how non-political was as an environment. It was incredibly cooperative, incredibly supportive. And that's what enabled the trust that we talked about to be built with all the executives and the teams, like a very, very, a tremendous amount of trust. And a lot of that was driven by the incredible transparency that we all had. And Lynda talked about earlier about the importance of transparency, and just essentially having access to all of the data, having the leadership present all the time, and essentially Larry and Sergey every week in front of all of the teams, and Eric and now Sundar doing that, and talking about all ranges of things, not only the good things but the problems. And I think that's what probably will define Google the most, and what's now a model or some aspects that are very present in many companies around, is that the executives are more present, are communicating to the teams a lot more. There's more transparency in many businesses around what they're doing. Businesses are not only talking about what they're doing well with their employees, but also talking about the problems that they have, and getting employees to drive themselves resolution, and have also a looser culture with less management layers in that sense, and I think all these things are very valuable. I would say apply the model that is relevant to your company now. The Google model dates 15 years or more now, and it's not necessarily perfectly relevant to companies, but I think there's a lot of aspects of it that work really well, and that you should apply to your businesses.
Sage advice.
If I could just add, I have huge respect for Google for the reasons that Karim talked about, what they did to scale that business, at the same time to maintain focus, to drive innovation, to build teams, to keep openness. However, there were failings in the model, which particularly on the side of diversity and representation and inclusion in the business, Google had to scale that business very, very, very quickly. And along the way, they actually went from being an organization that was fairly diverse to being an organization that was not diverse. And I think startups today need to think about that, how they can make sure that that doesn't happen, because it's really a responsibility of leadership, to ensure, diversity and inclusion and representation as you're building and growing the company.
Yeah, for sure. And I can say, by the way, that the best businesses I've been involved in, companies like MySQL and Truecaller and now Supermetrics in our current portfolio, and a few others, also my Nokia ad business back in the days, they have also been the most diverse culturally, geographically, et cetera, et cetera. So I completely believe in the strength of those, the vast amount of perspectives and the power that comes from that. Lynda, I wanted to continue actually in this vein a little bit. The companies that you've been working for, so for instance, AOL and Nielsen, were you the one pushing the envelope on these topics of diversity, inclusion, and so on, or did their leadership models already include it?
Well, it's really a combination of both. I mean, first, we talked about inclusiveness a lot at the beginning, that it's a key tenet of leadership. I've always felt that way. How you execute on it, is another question. And in terms of looking at best practices, really, Nielsen was the best place that I ever worked at in terms of driving for results with diversity and inclusion. Maybe it was because of Nielsen's mandate. Nielsen's business is to provide intelligence about the American consumer, the global consumer. So we really felt that we couldn't do that effectively unless our employee base was fully representative of the American population in particular in all its diversity. So Nielsen took that very, very seriously and translated it into action. So let me give you a few examples. When I was at Nielsen as a member of the executive leadership team, every year a portion of our annual bonus was directly tied to improving diversity and representation. It was, you would lose some of your bonus if you didn't show improvement. Every year, twice a year, we had a meeting with I had to meet with the CEO just to go through my scorecard on achieving results in diversity and inclusion. It wasn't in a separate meeting. It was a focused meeting just on that with the CEO. So the tone was set very much at the top by the CEO that this was important. So I've never been at a company actually that had done that. And those are learnings that I'm going to take with me going forward, setting the tone at the top and holding the executive leadership team directly accountable for improving diversity. I mean, there's been stuff in the US, for a long time, people were talking about, let's have a diverse slate every time we interview for management positions. That's called the Rooney Rule. It's been around for, I think, 15 years. You know what? When you look at the data right now, it hasn't worked. It's been around for 15 years. All the progressive companies in America have adopted that. It really hasn't moved the needle in achieving diversity. So I'm a big, big proponent of new tactics, like some of the tactics, that Nielsen talked about. And it's not only about diversity in the executive ranks, it's about, meaningful effort to recruit, at all levels in the company. And again, that's an onus of leadership in terms of the CEO. So I think companies need to do much, much more proactive outreach, into all communities. Don't always see that in recruiting. So in the US, that means recruiting from historically Black universities and other universities that, have a majority sort of underrepresented minorities, and doing things like setting up apprenticeship and other programs. When I was president of advertising.com, we set up a really successful apprenticeship program with a Black university called UMBC. We recruited engineers there, and it was tremendously, tremendously successful. And I learned so much from spending time at that university about what we needed to do to recruit more from the Black community in Baltimore. So, I know I'm going on and on about this, but it's an important issue right now, particularly today in America. And I think, again, it goes back to being a leader. I mean, the data is really atrocious. I read in the New York Times article this past weekend that Black college graduates in the US are as likely to be unemployed as white Americans with no college diploma, and that Black Americans with a college education hold less wealth than white Americans who have not even completed high school. So what's happening here? I mean, we really need to do much more to address what's been persistent racial economic inequality in America. And that again goes back, to leadership. So leadership in terms of how you're doing recruiting, holding your team accountable. And then in the culture, that you're creating, I talked about empathy. So you really need as leaders to create an environment where everybody feels comfortable speaking out. No one should feel like they're not wanted or they're not being heard. And our responsibility as leaders is really to create that environment and to move quickly to address any issues that could be construed as constituting harassment, or an unwelcome work environment. You see a lot of companies really failing here, struggling with some of these issues, not moving quickly to sort of defend who they are, and not creating the institutional mechanisms within the company, things like ombudsman programs, safe haven programs, making sure people don't have any fear of retaliation. So it's a complex issue, but it all goes back to leadership, and you need to get it right with a startup because it's gonna, be part of your culture, as you grow and scale.
Yeah, for sure.
That's it.
And as you say, I mean, if you start in the right place, it's much easier to end up in a good place as well. Karim, you wanted to chime in something, I guess.
No, I think Lynda said it incredibly well. The only thing I'd add is when you're thinking about startups, it is so much easier to fix all of these things when you're starting than it is much later on. So I would say just focus on it and do all the things that Lynda has mentioned in your early days, because if you grow and you've already established, a non-diverse culture, it's much more difficult to make the impact that you want later on.
Yeah. Time is flying when you're having fun, which we are, and there's only a few minutes to go. I want to make sure we get to the scaling bit a little bit more, and also maybe address the leadership in crisis, if possible, still in the 7 minutes. But before that, Lynda, there's a kind of a smaller, more specific question here to you around you mentioning the pivoting of your approach from being right all the time to becoming a part of the team. So what were some of the specific things you did to accomplish this is the question from Lisa Kirsch.
Hi, Lisa. I had great managers, great people that I worked for. Actually, in that particular example, I worked for a CFO. This is actually the AOL. I worked for a CFO at the time who I was the deputy CFO, and I was actually in charge of looking at new business proposals. And I took actually great delight in being super critical of every single new business proposal that came before me, because I was the decision maker on greenlighting, some of these new projects. And after doing it for a few times, I remember the CFO came to me and said, you're right all the time, but you're actually destroying the culture here by demotivating everybody that comes in and is, so excited about these new proposals. You have to find a better way to provide feedback constructively and positively, and not, just look like you're grading someone's paper. And he worked with me. I mean, honestly, he worked with me and watched me and made sure that I really worked harder to do that. So I think it's, again, an onus of leadership and partially what a great manager needs to do. I mean, I can't blame it on going to Harvard Law School, because you can blame everything on your past. We were trained to be that way, but you got to train it out of you to be a leader.
Good. And now my plan is failing. We're not going to get to scaling quite yet.
I know, but you asked me a very specific question.
No, not because of you, but because there is another very interesting question here, which goes back to what both of you have spoken about, and it's asking for some practical advice on how, as a leader, you can ensure this open and honest culture within the team, to discuss also the challenges and the tough decisions and so on. and it continues on, what is good openness versus is there too much openness and bad openness in that way? How do you strike the right balance? And this is now for the both of you. Maybe Karim, you go first.
I think from my perspective, there's no bad openness. I think the most important thing is making sure that everybody understands and is very clear that you always can argue and attack in some way concepts, but you never attack people. So the language that you use when you're having discussions is incredibly important, and you can coach people around that. But you should be able to discuss anything. Anything is on the table. You might not agree, and therefore I don't want anyone to think that within my teams that all decisions are consensus decisions, because consensus decisions end up basically being an average decision that everybody agrees with. But you must be ready to disagree and commit to the decisions that we're making. And if you set that out, you essentially then open it up to anything can be discussed and any decision can be changed, and it's open. How you drive that within your team? Well, first, you need to make sure that as a leader, you talk about why it's valuable for the organization and make sure that everybody's on board and aligned. And then you need to make sure that in the first few forum, if it's not happening readily, you basically poke a couple of people that have no problems doing it with you, that they do it in public, and your reaction then becomes essentially what the teams see as essentially a model for them to emulate, with you directly or within their own team as well. And I found that in the most of it works very well.
I agree with that. I'm a big believer in creating and empowering an executive committee of your direct reports and bringing them together quite frequently. What I've always done is brought my executive committee together at the beginning of the week to talk about what we're trying to get done, and at the end of the week to reflect on that and to resolve any issues that might have arisen. I don't see companies doing that all the time. Everybody does one-on-ones with one's direct reports. I actually think one-on-ones are insufficient in and of themselves. I've been in too many one-on-ones where my direct reports come to me to complain about someone else, and they sort of try to game you. They sort of tell you a half truth. I mean, they're half right, but they're also half wrong. So I actually hate that. And I'm a much bigger believer in having teams come together to talk honestly with each other about issues and to try to resolve those issues amongst themselves. It's hard to do. It's really, really hard to do, but I would much rather have people confront one another and talk about things directly than just running up sort of to the top to you as the leader, because it doesn't scale and it actually creates a bad team environment.
Great tips. Since we've been taking some questions here, I'm going to do one more question. We might be going a couple of minutes over time as a result of that, and I apologize to anybody who cannot stay for it. However, we are gonna edit this into a video which will stay within the hour, so that's my way of enabling this still. I do want to talk about the scaling, rapid scaling bit a little bit, and the question I have is essentially quite simple. It is, everything that you've been talking about today. Is it different when you're scaling very, very rapidly from when maybe there's not that much growth? Or is leadership actually the same thing anyways? And I will give one example as a point question to that. If you're leading just one team, if you have a very small business, versus if you're leading many teams and you're the leader of the team leader, or the leader of the team leader of the team leader, then it might look different. So is it different when you're scaling rapidly and things are moving and changing very fast?
I would say, yes, it's incredibly different. I've been in both positions, and in terms that, when I worked in publishing, things were growing still. I was still in the good days, but they were not growing very fast. When I worked in tech at Google in Asia Pacific, we're growing very fast. On mobile, we're growing incredibly fast. We're growing very fast now at Stripe. It's very different. You pay attention to very different things in the business. When you're scaling incredibly fast, empowerment of the team is even more important. Communication is even more important. You need to know as a leader that you trust your teams, because if you're scaling really fast, there's a number of discussions that you need to ensure are being made while you're not here. And you need to ensure that you have the right people making the decisions based on the right data, and therefore having the right processes and an aligned view of how you run the organization is even more important at times of scaling.
But I think there's some similarities in both. Definitely when you're scaling, there's different focuses and areas of emphasis. Recruiting is really big, getting recruiting right, engaging the team around recruiting. It might not be as important in a more established business. But I, as a leader, I'm a very, very big believer in setting strategic objectives and keeping those limited and focused, and then having measurable results that you want against those objectives. I guess people call those OKRs. I really think it works and it's hard to do, by the way. It's hard to say, these are the 4 most important things that we need to do, or the 3 most important things, and here's what success looks like. And if you could do that as a leader and transcend that through a team, I think it's the best thing to do. I've seen a lot of startups that don't do that. I was working with a startup recently where the CEO basically asked his different direct reports all to come up with their own OKRs that actually didn't align at all with one another. And he thought he was doing the right thing. That's not the right thing. It's not going to work. You're going to end up with a team that's really disconnected, all doing different things. So again, the focus of leadership is bringing that all together and knitting that together. And I think that exists in any business, whether it's a startup, whether it's a company that's scaling, or a more established business.
Yeah, that's true.
I would love to continue. Unfortunately, we can't, but I think that was a very good note to end this webinar, or whatever better word we're still looking for this event. It was truly wonderful to hear about your thoughts about leadership in general, and I think those thoughts and your advice and tips and practical perspectives, they are also reflective of you as leaders. You are clearly wonderful leaders. I enjoyed this a lot. I learned a lot. I'm sure our audience did learn a lot. So thanks so much. I mean, we are very, very privileged to have had you here today.
Thank you
for having us. Yeah.
So indeed, as mentioned, we will edit this into a video. I hope the audience will also come back to the video and share that with friends and colleagues, because there were many golden nuggets in this overall very, very interesting discussion on leadership. Thank you, Lynda. Thank you, Karim.
Thanks. Have a great day.